Now, to keep this video title consistent with the rest of the playlist, I've called it a keep or sell, but actually a more accurate title for this one would be replace or refund. The watch I ordered arrived with a stubborn stain on the back of the clasp, which I only noticed after starting to film the review. I think it was likely caused by some adhesive getting stuck under the plastic wrapping that the watch was shipped in. Either way, it wasn't going to come off. I made the decision not to adjust the links as I knew it was going to have to go back, so if you're wondering why some of the shots in the video are a little more awkward than usual, that's the answer. Normally I would have waited to get another watch, but this took nearly a month to arrive already, and it would have meant delaying the video for several months more. Having said all that, I've chosen to avoid showing the issue in the video and tried my best to ignore it as a consideration in reviewing this model. It is, after all, one small problem with one watch and not something that should be held against an entire range or a brand. My first thought when ordering this watch was back to a review I did a couple of months ago on an Steeldive model, the sister company to Steeldive. My experience then was a good set of specifications, but a poorly finished individual watch. Some people in the comments mirrored the same experiences, others had a much better time, so it seemed to me as if the production lines were perhaps a little inconsistent in terms of quality. As Steeldive are the more expensive of the two brands, I went into this watch expecting a slight step up. So with that in mind, let's get into the discussion of this model. First of all, why did I actually buy this SD1953 in the first place? It certainly doesn't come across as a particularly mature or refined choice. Well, the answer there is simple: the colour. Purple is one of my favourite colours, behind black and green, and it's a rarely used colour in terms of watch design. I have a Zodiac Super Seawolf, which has some purple accents, but while that has some nice Black Panther vibes, it's nowhere near as full on purple as this. Frankly, I've never seen a watch like it in terms of colour, so I wanted to check it out in person, even if I'm not the biggest fan of homage designs like this. I believe this is one of two new model colours introduced relatively recently. I can't give an exact date, but both this and the teal version are tagged with the new icon on AliExpress at least. Browsing through these watches was a little bit confusing for me at first, as the photographs would indicate that some models are much thicker than others. I think the reality is they are all the same specifications though. It's perhaps worth mentioning that far more traditional colourways are also available, should the purple not float your boat. I'll stop there just to say that actually, I'm not a big fan of this colour in person. The bezel has a plastic kid's toy or candy wrapper look to it, which under some lights matches quite well with the dial, but under others doesn't really match at all, and in large part that's simply because of the sunburst effect on the dial itself. Now, I made it clear in my Steeldive video that I'm not a fan of their logo or branding, and I'd flag up the same issue here. The thing is, under most lighting conditions, the text and the logo that are printed on the dial are very hard to read. This watch was a nightmare to film for that reason. My camera would not focus on that dial and kept flitting between lenses, so I apologise if any of that has made the final cut. The dial printing really either needed to be in black, replaced by an applied alternative, or removed entirely. I also think personally a deeper purple would have been a lot nicer. Sometimes you get that from the sunburst effect on the dial, but obviously that is lighting dependent. This is a 300 meter rated diver, so some thickness is to be expected. The watch is 13.5mm thick and comes in at 41mm in diameter, constructed from stainless steel and sapphire crystal, and features an NH35 movement. In terms of specifications, you're getting a pretty good deal for a watch that you can pick up in the £60 to £70 range. It's worth shopping around it a little here too, as although people might think of Steeldive as an AliExpress brand, they do also have a UK warehouse. I'm not sure if this is their only overseas one globally, but they have an EU specific store, so I highly doubt it. Sometimes it can be cheaper to buy the watches direct to avoid having to pay import taxes and heavier shipping fees. There are other brands offering specifications for around the same price point or below, but Steeldive have a reputation for being a cut above in terms of quality in this price bracket. For me personally though, the watch is too large. I can probably get away with a 41mm watch, but it just isn't my preference. I would say that the build quality of the watch was solid all round. There was very little rattle in the bracelet, the clasp was rock solid, and aside from a couple of sharp corners on the edges of the lugs and the issue with the stain on the clasp, there were no issues with the finishing anywhere. A design flaw I would flag is the end links though. They jut out a little and can get caught against the second links, making this watch wear a little wider than you might initially expect. I think as a result, if I were getting this watch again, I might well opt for the 3-link bracelet, or perhaps save myself a little money with the rubber strap option and put this on something else entirely. In terms of aesthetics, the SD1953 is a Submariner clone. It has the same handset, indices, bezel layout, case shape, and so on. You're either going to be okay with that or you aren't. If you don't like the Submariner, then clearly this won't appeal. If you don't like homage watches, then this is definitely not for you. I have to say, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of homage watches. I thought that the purple would be a nice unique selling point here, but really it isn't particularly well executed in my opinion. Having said that, were I in the market for a beta watch to be rough and ready with, perhaps take to the beach and so on, then I can't fault this model for its specifications and price. The purple wouldn't look horrible on the beach, and there are other fun or serious colours available. It doesn't quite get my seal of approval, but I wouldn't dismiss it for everyone. One thing I think the purple colourway has in its favour is that despite being a homage watch, it clearly isn't trying to pretend to be a Rolex. Certainly you wouldn't fool anyone with this. One area where I don't think they've done a particularly good job of being, shall we say, inspired by the Submariner is the Cyclops. If anything, there's far too much magnification going on here for it to be a particularly useful feature on the watch, as with some dates you're going to have to move your position around to be able to see the entire number clearly, as the magnification is just too strong. An area where this watch really impressed me though was the lume. It performed really well over a 10-minute period, but the initial glow on the hands and indices here was fantastic and performed well beyond my expectations. Similar to my last video, I've put together a mock-up of the improvements I think could be made to this in order to elevate it a little. Now, I'm not an expert in Photoshop, so I can only apologise for the rough edges here. The changes I've made are a more deeper, uniform purple. I think what I've ended up with is perhaps a little garish, but it does give some contrast with the dial printing. And I've used applied elements here rather than printed ones. The other touch I've made to the watch is reducing the magnification on the Cyclops. I hope you can see past the iffy Photoshop work here to see the potential that exists for this watch to be just that little bit sharper than it is. To sum up, I won't be keeping this watch. It hasn't damaged my impression of the brand. This watch is excellent value, and I hope in future that, like San Martin, Steeldive start to branch out into their own designs and focus on smaller and more refined models rather than some of the carbuncles they are currently selling. What holds me back here are the dimensions, which I knew going in I wasn't going to like, but had hoped that the unique coloration would compensate for. Sadly, for me it doesn't. But that's a big part of the watch journey for me. If you aren't willing to experiment and refine or diversify your tastes, they won't expand and grow. I wasn't looking to get something ordinary, and while this definitely isn't in terms of its use of colour, a deeper tone, more consistency between the dial and bezel, and contrast between the printing and dial were needed, alongside a less aggressive Cyclops. It's another case where I'm more enamoured with the vision and potential of the watch rather than the reality. I would say that I feel there is a small but noticeable difference here between the Steeldive and the Adizdive I mentioned earlier. It's a step up in my opinion in terms of finishing, quality and wearability. If you've had experience with Steeldive before, let me know which models to look out for in future in the comments below. I'm definitely willing to give the brand another go further down the line, but this watch is definitely going back. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please consider dropping the video a like and subscribing if you'd like to see more. As ever, I appreciate your time and support with the channel.